Hello, Dragon Slayers. This is Dr. Tom Bittker, and we are joined by my favorite cousin, the knowledgeable and esteemed attorney and author, Michael Dallen. Michael has written a wonderful book, The Rainbow Covenant, which is a beautiful text on the Noahic laws and the Old Testament. And if you want to help us, pick up a copy of Dragon Slaying. And if you don't want to read Dragon Slaying, we are now available as of this weekend on Audible. So you can catch Dragon Slaying and listen to Audible. Also, should you have any desire to sponsor us, contact us in care of Dr. Tom, author at gmail.com. Well, Michael, a lot has happened in the city of Detroit since the 1967 riots. The 1967 riots were provoked by the assassination of Martin Luther King.
No, those were the 68 riots.
Oh, what were the 67 riots?
The 67 riots are another outpouring of chaos and lawlessness. The 68 riots were a year later, and half a year later, as you say, pursuant to the assassination of Martin Luther King. But it was much more contained, and the law enforcement response was much more robust immediately.
I'm in error then. Okay, so it was what provoked the 67 riots?
There was some arrests at a Blind Pig on 12th and on 12th Street. It was
for our audience, Michael. What's a Blind Pig?
An illegal drinking establishment. There was a lot of black nationalism in that area. 12th and Claremont was a thriving business district. And I remember going there with my mom a few months in May. And we were there, and we were seeing all these black folks wearing black nationalist regalia, Muslim hats, and white and black robes, and there were a lot of halls, and we were not being looked at fondly, and we both felt that, I was just a kid, but we both felt we'd better get the hell out of here. This is not a welcoming place, and which is very unlike the Midwest in general, and Detroit particularly. That you felt that you felt hostile eyes on you.
Just for our historical context, my birthplace, my home, where I was raised in for the first 10 years of my life, was at 2281 Atkinson, which is just one street north of Claremont and 2 streets over from 12th Street. I lived on a block between 14th Street and LaSalle. And the important point I'd raise about that is when I grew up, I had a lot of African American friends. They were largely from 2-parent families and seemed to be pretty nice kids, as were their parents. And I could walk to and from school, grade school, which is about a mile to a mile and a quarter walk, and went unmolested for all the 10 years I've lived there. So a lot changed from my departure from that neighborhood in 1950 and 17 years later, 1967. But even then, I recall in 1962, I went to a largely black auditorium where I saw one of the first performances of the Supremes. A lot must have
Well,
changed.
Motown came out of here. The most wonderful music was coming out of here. 67 was a year of great cultural innovation, rock and roll, um, Cream, the Doors, um, the Stones, the black music was just flourishing.
So we
But
got Marvin Gaye was then,
yeah,
and Smokey Robinson, and the Supremes.
well,
And
Barry Gordy had a regular hit factory, and he lived up by closer to us in the northwest part of town, by 7 Mile and Livernois. Um, but it was an intense, culturally very rich, churning time. But in '60, you'd begun a wave of anti-colonialism and a consciousness of negritude, as they call it, passed over the colonial world. Ghana had gotten free. Ghana under Kwame Nkrumah had gotten rid of the British. The British and French and Dutch and Portuguese colonialism were teetering, and you had
there's a however to that, and that is when I was in West Africa, uh, I visited Ghana often, and I found it to be one of the most hospitable places that I've ever been to.
well, anti-colonialism was mostly pretty cheerful, and I mean, very, very hopeful, and we really expected great things to come from it. I mean, I think you read Frantz Fanon, the great
Yeah,
black Martinique philosopher of revolution, who was promising these wonderful things to be born from it, new art, a new flowering of music and art. Um, which were mostly disappointed. I mean, we just didn't get that. We had new, certainly in the graphic arts, we got Bupkus, which is Slavic Yiddish word meaning like nothing. The music really was something though. Reggae began. You had in Motown. Uh, was thriving, and you had white people adopting. There was a lot of crossover, um, but you had a lot of noxious. I would call it noxious black racism that propounded the superiority of black folks to whites, and with a lot of anti-Semitism. Um, a lot of
was
these
it?
areas.
Did this coincide with the rise of Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, and the whole black nationalistic movement?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
well, and that was partly born in Detroit and Chicago. Uh, Farad, the mystery man behind uh, the black Muslims, who was the semi divine inspirational figure behind Elijah Muhammad, showed up in Detroit. Or Fard, what was his name? And you had all these. You had a new religion popping up, and the new religion, it came from here, from Chicago, but it was extremely weird pagan religion that taught that white people were not really human, that we were the creation of an evil black scientist, that we dominated and oppressed the black man through tricknology. He wrote. It's still, it's still struggling. It's still there, but it's a very marginal movement today. It's a prison religion now mostly. Um, in fact, Islam in general in American prisons is something that black. We have crazy levels of black incarceration in our prisons, and in order to get along, people join the Muslims, but usually they quit when they get out, because it is such a prison religion and it is pretty noxious. Um,
Well, if we get the historical context then, because the other bit of irony is that if you will, the white epicenter of black liberation movement was ironically in Detroit and Port Huron, uh, fueled by the energies of my late friend Tom Hayden. Tom Hayden convened a gathering in Port Huron, Michigan,
yeah,
and wrote essentially the preamble of the Constitution for the Students for Democratic Society. It's kind of funny. I knew Tom as a friend, and I've been relatively aware of his interest in civil rights. He and I were both research associates at a research institute in Ann Arbor. He was working with a conflict resolver named Anatole Rappaport, and I was working with psychiatrist John C. Pollard, we were giving acid to space cadets, and they were not hallucinating.
literal space cadets.
Yeah, right. Part of the astronaut program. So these guys were so tightly wired, they would never hallucinate.
I bet.
Well, so I went down the hall one evening and dropped in to say hello to Tom, find out how he was doing. I knew he was going back and forth to participate in the movement in the South. And occasionally we would see photos of him getting the crap beat out of him by the Southern police. And I said, "Hey, Tom, have you seen this?" And I showed him the Port Huron statement, which had not had any author on it. He said, yeah, I wrote it. So Tom was the Thomas Jefferson of the movement. And that went on all the way to the Chicago 7.
Well, we're not talking about the South African liberation movement. Detroit had a white police force that was like an extraterritorial colonial police force that really was rough on and unfair to its black people. We had a 45% black population, and they were policed by, strangers mostly, these white people who were not sympathetic to them. While in South Africa, you had a really oppressive, a much more oppressive regime, and a lot of the guys, they had a lot of Tom Hayden's and Baba Ram Dass's too. I mean, they had their share of Jewish revolutionaries like Joe Slovo, and we had them in Detroit. There were a lot of Lithuanian Jews who had come, descendants of very Orthodox Jews who had come to South Africa and here in Detroit to the same thing, and they spread the word, and because the parents had been Orthodox and the children weren't at all, but they did believe in human. These were all Jews who have the central message of Torah, that we all exist in the image of God, and they went to work with a will to make society over in the image of that principle. So it wasn't just Tom Hayden, but it was here we had Bernie Goodman, who recruited all these, the first black lawyers accepted in a white firm. The white firms were Jewish firms, and it was the same thing in Johannesburg and Cape Town with Nelson Mandela and Joe Slovo, going to work with Joe Slovo and the like.
Well, if you look at the history of the civil rights arguments before the Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall's staff was largely staffed with Jewish attorneys. So there was, and my own cousin from the other side of the family, the Grossman side of the family, Leonard was the founding member of the ACLU. So there's a rich tradition of that involvement in what I would say the breaking down of racial barriers.
A great
Anyway,
passion, very great passion for that, and as they regarded it, these non-religious guys regarded it as the truest expression of religion.
now, a bit of irony is my daughter-in-law's father, or stepdad really, and the guy who officiated at her wedding is this wonderful fellow named Napoleon Williams. And Napoleon grew up in Tennessee, was a very bright guy, and made it all the way to Harvard, got his law degree, and he was instrumental in pursuing civil rights arguments at a national level. And so there's a lot of intermixing here. At any rate, I was overseas at the time of the 67 riots and the 68 riots. And what I recall is we would send tape recordings back and forth to my then living parents. And on our tape recordings were things such as the call to worship Allah from the mosque that surrounded us. And we would also talk about the camels that were walking by our door in our compound. When they would send their tapes, I would hear Huey helicopters hovering above them, as if my parents were in a combat zone.
It was up close and personal. The rioting, the looting happened everywhere. We do forget that it was a multiracial breakdown. The looting mobs were black and white. And the people who came into the stores to loot the color TVs and the washing machines and the like were multiracial.
Well, at a personal level, the sad thing for me is when I came back to the city, I recall distinctly that demarcation on Woodward Avenue. For those of you out there, Woodward Avenue is Detroit's essentially main thoroughfare north and south before freeways. And there was a demarcation between Detroit and I believe the next suburb was Ferndale on 8 Mile. And everything south of 8 Mile in Detroit looked like a bomb had hit it. The whole area looked like it was firebombed.
Well, I'm right here at 8 and Woodward, Tom. So take it easy on that subject. That we had the federal.
But Michael, when I visited you, that had been restored.
Well, no, we never lost it. They had the federal troops that finally, belatedly got called in, and they rested and played frisbee at the state fair grounds, which is just south of 8 Mile. But we had our beautiful, wonderful shopping areas where there were lots and lots of Jewish merchants and fine, fancy stores, Doubleday bookstores and things like that. And a lot of that got torched, and the city never recovered from that. That was a body blow, and the smoke. I remember the smoke in the air. This was massive lawlessness. Today it's called the rebellion, but that's revisionist history. It was a huge outbreak of lawlessness. I think people were just tired of prosperity, tired of the same old, same old. It was a hot summer, and people wanted change. I do remember, though, there was this religious component of Liberation Now, and you had these what I would call evil black pastors who were mostly not Christians, but they had come up with they were trying to develop new religions. They were looking for new gods. Not long ago, I bought a lot of I collect, and I bought a lot of really beautiful African art from an institution called the Shrine of the Black Madonna that had some connection with Christianity, but was mostly a pagan, an invented religion by I forgot the name. It was a Reverend Klieg who founded it. And I remember Reverend Klieg was famous for counseling his parishioners to get up on top of buildings and shoot at the tanks that were coming down Livernois. And I mean, they were literally, we had all these responsible peacemakers, our black congressmen, our black leaders of all different stripes, counseling peace, and go home, and you had the Kliegs who were counseling shoot the white devils, and that was part of the spirit of the time. Yeah, it's interesting that what they left behind, at least at this stage in history, seems to be nothing but dust and ashes. It was a going out of business sale that I was collecting. Klieg had died, and the people were not unable to maintain the religious movement that he'd initiated.
So I got several fond memories. I recall when the year before I entered medical school that summer, I worked as a research associate at the VA in Allen Park near Dearborn. And the guy who was really running the lab was a guy named Ollie. Loved Ollie. He was a former Army Ranger. He was built like a tank, and you wouldn't fuck with Ollie at all. And he knew I liked music, so he and I would go together to these black bars. And I felt okay when I was with Ollie. It was all right. And then I recall subsequently, I went with my older brother Jim and Louise to a venue called Shane Park. And we were watching a concert of all these wonderful black musicians, Nancy Wilson, and it was really a wonderful experience. And I recall that before the concert, we got up and a few brave souls sang the Star Spangled Banner. But then there was another song that was sung, and I tapped on the shoulder of the lady in front of me and said, "What are we singing?" And she smiled and looked over her shoulder at me and said, "That's the Black National Anthem, Sonny."
It didn't have the legs of the Star Spangled Banner. You don't hear it a lot anymore. I think that Shane Park is now, I think they renamed it after Aretha Franklin.
Oh, really? Good.
Who's entombed across the street from us here, just south of 8 Mile, and the Woodlawn Tomb. The races have come together in a beautiful way.
Which is what I want to talk about, because one of the things that became apparent to me is I could never quite understand the calculus of Minneapolis. Okay, George Floyd is killed, and Minneapolis decides to do a Detroit. They burn everything down within the city, which absolutely destroyed the quality of life of that town. And I recall that Detroit had a chief of police that made it very clear that's not going to happen here. And it didn't. How do you account for that?
Well, for one thing, the police department here is mostly black, and
Of course.
it was in Minneapolis. You had Los Angeles policing methods in force. You know, it was a very small force that was known for its tendency to harshness and violence. And you also had I mean, you had a particularly egregiously mean guy leading a troop of police. I put his name out of my mind, but he's doing a hard time. Um, he, and he was supervising police. I we don't we didn't have anybody like that in the Detroit Police Department. Somebody like that would, a martinet, a sadist. Um, if we had anybody like that, he'd be black, and probably much less inclined to uh, do that kind of harm to other black people.
Well, Detroit's political leadership now is largely rooted in the African American community.
Oh yeah, it is. Yeah, we elected a white mayor because we were sick of the corruption of the previous mayor. Our former mayor was Kwame Malik Kilpatrick. Kilpatrick was a black dynastic, political dynastic family. Kwame is the name of the African dictator who presided over the Ghana that
Kwame
you like.
Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah.
Kwame Nkrumah, yeah, who was a crook and a failed dictator. And then,
However, the U.S. government gave him enormous sums of money.
well, we hoped for the best from the guy. We didn't, and there was he came up in a tradition of Marcus Garveyism,
Right.
of black self-realization, and that had some legs, and there was some promise to it. So I think we had a good deal of sympathy. The Black Star Lines that he set up is still, an extant shipping line. Jamaica and Ghana too, have been influenced by Garveyism, as was Nkrumah. But he was a crook, a dictator, but then Kwame's middle name, Malik, which it's the same as the Hebrew. It's a Semitic word. It means melech or king.
Mm-hmm.
So his first name is that of a corrupt African dictator. His second name is King, and then he's named after these self-important, self-entitled black American political dynasts who believe that it's our turn at the trough of public service. So I would say that good old Kwame, who was pardoned by Trump, one crook to another, if I may say so, and I know we don't get into politics, but Trump, he commuted the sentence, rather. He didn't pardon him.
Not on this podcast. We don't discuss political differences. Never touch it.
But it was just so funny that Trump he told Trump how he loved him. I mean, he was his supporter, he was his man, and Trump responded, as he does to such flattery, and if I may say so, and commuted his sentence. But he was doing serious time for massive corruption. But then the poor guy went out and he married a young girl who had always had a thing for him, who was used to be the best friend of a girl who was more or less my niece, by marriage, or by affinity, and they'd come to hate each other. But that girl is something else, and anybody who can stay married to her probably deserves the thanks of men and women, and it cannot be easy. So that's part of his sentence, that he's got her now.
So what happened to Coleman Young?
Coleman Young was a regular left wing, um, deeply American, former Tuskegee Airman, brilliant guy, um, who who replaced uh, a white sheriff who was running to keep white hegemony and white dominance of Detroit alive. And Coleman was the opposition to that. And he came into office and was he was frequently a very rash speaker. He was friends with these Jewish revolutionary types, these Lithuanian guys, and and he was a comer, but always well dressed. And I remember he was saying, "We're going to drive. It's ours now. It we're going to drive the crooks and criminals out of 8 Mile." Um, and the white business community was terrified, and they skedaddled, and so did property values suddenly in that year. That was I think it was 70.
Right, and that, with that, Detroit lost its tax revenue base.
It did. Yeah. Well, people just ran from Detroit. You later you go into these office buildings, and it was like visiting the Andrea Doria or something, where the coffee had been poured, all the calendars and all the different offices were turned to the same date, which is 1 month after Coleman took office, and they left. They just left. We had all these areas in Detroit called Copper Canyon, where the police and the firemen mostly lived. They emptied out. Um, and Detroit, for the interregnum of Coleman's years, tried to become the capital of Black America. You know, I mean, it was it was conscious, but we thought we had the cultural cachet and the economic clout to make this the leading black town, more than Chicago, more than Harlem, more than New York, more than St. Louis or any other place. That this was going to be um, the flagship of an American black renaissance. We couldn't do it. There just wasn't the money. The white people, big money, pulled out, um, and it was a tough time. And it was like Johannesburg. I understand Johannesburg today. Crime just skyrocketed. Um, you had a youthful population at the time, and the youth was not particularly attached to the value of thou shalt not steal. So there's a lot of robberies. We were robbed all the time. I mean, there were robberies. It was dangerous. There's rape. There's murder. Um,
It was
and
actually at one time referred to as Murder City, not Motor City.
Murder City. We had a horrible thing where on the night before Halloween, people would go out and burn the town down. I mean, you'd have people walking around with gas cans. The kids would do this. So this was regarded as fun. Devil's Night. Um, it was this crazy nihilistic destruction. We've lived through some really interesting phenomena. I mean, you wouldn't think that people would be so stupid as to go and burn down their own town, but you'd be wrong. They did. Um, there was celebration of violence and of fire. I remember as a young lawyer, um, I had to go and collect from some defendant, and I was talking to these lovely Jehovah Witness ladies, black ladies, heavy black ladies who were raising teenagers, and I remember being there at 9 o'clock in the morning to get my money for my client, and the kids kind of oozed down from upstairs, and they'd been out all night, and and their kindly grandmother, aunt, whoever they were, the matriarchs of the family would say to them, "Oh, you poor dear, you've been out all night, weren't you? Well, go and get something to eat." You know, from our family backgrounds, if we did something like that, we were never beaten, but we would have been beaten if we had done anything like that. Um, there was great lawlessness, and even the neighborhood businesses had to move out because you could have barbed wire and dogs, but you couldn't put up with these dangerous, wild, larcenous hominids who could take your barbed wire and and set fire. So that was some weird times. Later, we got a Dennis Archer, a jurist, very well dressed, moderate kind of black man, um, who eventually replaced Kwame, and that was like putting an American flag back on our buildings. Instead of the flag of New Africa or whatever, you had a determined return to American values, regardless of the race of the governing class. That coincided with Clinton's time in office, and it was the 80s, and it was a good time in America. And it's been a return ever since. But Tommy, I remember you have Tom Hayden, but I remember these buddies of mine. We played water polo in a Detroit high school, and it was the Devils versus the Brothers. And believe me, it was not great being on the team with the Devils, particularly at the deep end of the water polo field at Mumford. And and those two guys were really good guys, but they became black revolutionaries, and they died. They both died in a hail of bullets. The wonderful, talented guys, meant so well, but they got caught in this, and people do. History is it's like a yeah, it's like a sorting machine, and when you're sorted out, the results are not always gentle. They the one killed police, and they thought the police were complicit in a heroin. There was a heroin epidemic, I should mention, and these guys were correct, and that the Detroit police were complicit to some extent in the heroin and selling the heroin, and they shot and killed, and it was a nationwide manhunt. My one buddy got gunned down in a historically black college dorm down in Georgia, but it was tough times, and there was a time I remember the editor of the Saturday Saturday Review of Literature, Norman Cousins, was writing, and he was talking about race at that time, and he was saying, well, this is what happens when you run into a black person, and the thoughts that go through your mind. Is he militant? Will he harm me? And this is a long time ago, thank God, but now the races are all together. Nobody thinks like maybe in some rural or non southern places or other places, but here the races really do get along. There's a lot of and there are a lot of mixed marriages, and people don't ever think about it.
Well, I can recall when I visited you, it was about 3 years ago, and Seth and I had stayed at this think it was a residence inn or the equivalent of that, and it was largely run by black administrators and black staff, and they were wonderful to us. We experienced no animus at all. Uh,
We've, yeah, we've come a long way. It
yeah,
really, it's really,
what,
really good. You know, I mean, we're not completely out of the woods yet, but you can't deny that we've come, an enormous distance.
well, I felt very proud of what it had become of the city. Now, I'd say, like other industrial towns, you cannot really understand Detroit unless you just understand their interaction with their athletic teams, the Tigers, the Lions, the Wings, and all of them have mobilized the city. I understand that the Detroit Tigers have a statue of Willie Horton, who was one of their outfielders on a championship team, outside of one of their stadiums. Because I believe in one time during one of the riots, Willie climbed on top of a vehicle and essentially counseled people to cool it, to be kind, to decrease the hostility.
Well, I, I'm not a sports guy. I play sports, but I don't pay much attention. But I've watched these black guys talk sports. Now it's a new thing. They're playing these gambling video games. So sometimes they don't even talk to each other, but they talk sports instead of politics or instead of religion. It's a lot safer. And you want to, I want to kill myself rather than listening to the interminable talk about, they know the high school basketball teams, they know the baseball teams, they know the hockey teams, and you can lose your mind, listening to this blabber, you know. Well, when they do talk religion or politics, you get some strange stuff. Um,
Well,
the re-
I was going to take this to the emergence of Joe Dumars. So Joe was an off guard on the Bad Boys. I think the last Piston team to win a championship with Bill Lambier and others. And Joe ultimately morphed himself into a political leader, did he not?
well, there's Dumars. Dave Bing became mayor of
Yeah,
Detroit.
right. And Dave Green, yes.
Yeah, this hyper rational, calculating, brilliant man, a self-made millionaire, multimillionaire who became the mayor. Real technocratic kind of guy.
But
Uh,
he was trusted by both sides for the most part.
well, both sides being white and black. Oh,
Right.
yeah, everybody. Yeah, but I don't know. I mean, a lot of you were talking about James Craig, who's running for is he running for mayor or governor?
I think he's running
He
for
doesn't
governor.
really know, but
Yeah.
he's a Republican, and he's running for, he's a Trumper. I don't think this will fly. Um, I would hope that anybody running for a responsible political office in America should be a small R Republican. Somebody who believes in government of and by and for the people. And I don't know about Craig. We're not seeing a great deal of political wisdom coming from any male black politicians in our local politics, um, that I can think of. They're not many.
Well,
Uh,
I would say that the small R Republicans that you refer to are on the endangered species list.
yeah, yeah. It's very scary. What is happening is just terrifying.
Well, they've
But
got a huge
we have
following.
we have a lot of patriots, white and black, and You know, and I think the basic message of America, of government of and by and for the people, is a government under law, is so compelling that it will prevail ultimately. But right now we're, you know, in some dicey times. Um,
Well, I'm hoping that leadership will emerge that can speak for most of us.
the
So,
problem is that people
where
have to
would
get
Detroit now?
people get the kind of government that they deserve, and on that basis, I fear for my country very much because I don't know what we deserve.
No,
Uh,
actually, I see it a little differently, Mike. I see a polarization in the parties. So if you speak as a moderate in either party, you're not able to generate the heat and the energy that's behind the extremes. So you've got essentially the people that would be, from American historical perspectives, the Henry Clays, the conciliators, the people that reach across the aisle, the Tip O'Neills, and so on. They no longer exist. They are considered invalid for these times.
well, I'm terrified. Of course, I'm terrified by the anti-Semitism and the pro-Palestinianism that you get on the left. Uh,
Well, let me just give you a compelling illustration. I don't know what your take is on this, but I believe Kamala Harris made one of the most compelling unforced errors in politics by not choosing Josh Shapiro as her running mate and instead choosing the clown from Minnesota.
running mates don't decide elections.
Well, it may not, but she would have taken Pennsylvania and Shapiro.
I doubt it. And that kind of nerdy sounding nasal guy didn't. I love the guy that she did pick. I thought he was beautiful, but I don't know. I mean, how we ended up with an anti small r Republican as our unquestioned leader is a nightmare, and um, but a lot of it is if people aren't reading daily newspapers or newspapers at all. They get a lot of their news from TV, which doesn't allow you to absorb the message, to put your whatever you're hearing into long term memory. Um, think of the world that we came out of in the 50s, where the adults, and they were distinctly adult figures, they dressed in, I dreaded having to dress like that. Um, and with ties on and double-breasted suits all the time, and but they read the newspapers. There was always somebody reading a newspaper, and now nobody does. And I'm a librarian's son. I really do believe in the virtue of reading, and I just don't know what you can get off. Um, I watch reels and things and social media stuff, and it's very compelling, but um, I don't know how much goes into long term memory either. I have the sense that the American public is more easily manipulated. And then we have the whole problem of our religions. Um, I don't know if you're aware of this, but parenthetically, as we're speaking of Black Americans, the Black churches are failing. They are going down. We think of them as these impregnable bastions of song and wealth and leadership, and they're having a terrible time sustaining even their buildings. You know, young people are not flocking into them. Even the lousy prosperity gospel places are not doing well, or particularly they're not doing well.
What about in the southeastern United States? Is that also true?
Yes, yeah, it is. Yeah, I
So,
mean, they
so,
come
so,
from a
so, so the
greater
epicenter
strength.
of Atlanta, Georgia, is no longer the epicenter of black churches.
Well, they come from such a position of strength it will take a long time for them to fade, but they are fading. And
So
you get,
what's replacing it?
I say again,
What is replacing it? Where are the
oh,
young people
they're,
going?
I, social media people staying at home. They're busy with, there's this wonderful line that it's in the Chumash, the Torah um, volume that I like so much, the Hertz Chumash, and they have a quote from a German Protestant uh, thinker who was saying that let me get the quote exactly, without an elevating public purpose, the people soon descend into a morass of superstition, sensuality, and animalism. And uh, I think that is an actual law of history. Um, and we don't seem to currently have such a public purpose. When you talk to people, you get you expect to hear I as a Franklin Roosevelt Democrat, I expect to hear from more Franklin Roosevelt Democrats, and and you'll hear crazy stuff that is very antinomian, very anarchistic. You'll hear that all government is bad, and I don't want to hear anything about it. I just want to cultivate my own garden or whatever. This extraordinary um, short-sighted nihilism, um, and disaffection and apathy. Um, and I was talking to one fellow. He wants me to know what a friend of Israel he is. He's very much a Christian, and he's the biggest. He has a goyish kopf, that is to say, a Gentile way of thinking about things. And he's telling me that in 4 years I expect to be gone. And I go, what? Is there cancer? Is there something wrong? No, I'm going to be raptured up. The world will end, and the tribulations will come, but I will be called up to heaven. And I mean, and that is one of, that's, people are thinking in these kinds of crazy terms, and they don't need a pastor or congregation to teach them that stuff. They can just, get down into the apocalypse. They can get into the Gospel of John or whatever it's called, Revelation, and get that, this in Hebrew we'd say mishigas, um, that that unfits people for small r republicanism. We got to be somewhat together on this. We don't have to be 100%, but you have to have a critical mass of people who really do want to keep together government of and by the people. So, and
I think part of the problem is a legacy of our public education system right now, where uh, I believe that both you and I went to a public school. I suspect you did too. And although not perfect, we were taught critical thinking skills. We were taught critical thinking skills in college. In fact, I was a philosophy minor, history major as a pre-med. I did my pre-med courses, but I took heavily humanities, philosophy, and history.
well, and think of how we read. Think of how our people read, and you don't get anybody reading like that anymore. No, nobody reads like we. I mean, for fun. You know, remember reading Kafka? No, who reads?
Okay, you got to read the Metamorphosis, though. Everybody out there has got to read the Metamorphosis.
I was talking to a fellow who teaches at one of my old high schools.
For those of you who haven't read it, the protagonist wakes up one morning and finds that he is turned into a cockroach.
6-foot cockroach, right? Yeah.
Yes,
One of the most famous lines in literature. Well, I mentioned it to this guy who taught English at my old high school, and he'd never heard of Kafka, you know. So he's a new generation, charming black guy. He's got great music. He has things he can teach, but, he shouldn't be teaching English, or literature. And, but the schools have to hire who they can hire. Um, so, so that's another thing. Um,
I could do recall just a vignette. When I was a freshman in college, I placed out of English and was took an alternate path, which was a great books course amplified by an accelerated, I guess you would call it an honors English class. And I remember the second semester of that year, the first semester we did the classical Greeks, Aristotle, Plato, all those folks, Sophocles, Euripides. By the second year, we were into Goethe, and we passed through Dante uh, and John Milton. But I remember, I think the biggest book we read was Cervantes' Don Quixote. And for anybody who hasn't read it, that could be one of the funniest pieces of literature ever written. And I had a buddy of mine who was in the same course and we were roommates. We were just lying on the bed reading this book and just cracking up.
Yeah. No, I'm hip. I've read it. I remember I was reading it on one of our trips to Marquette with Aaron and Nell Stern, and Nell was so impressed that I was reading Don Quixote. But Tommy, I was in Kathmandu about 2-3 months ago, and I was with a graduate of the military academy at West Point. And he was a great guy. He served his time, and there we all are traveling, and we were going on about his college education, and I had just been reading about a biography of William Tecumseh Sherman, the great Union Civil War general. So I knew the curriculum, of Sherman better than Mark did, and but we're going on about it, and they tried to cram more stuff into the 4 years that they would have these young humans, to try to turn them into officers and generals, and they did it, back in the 1830s, and then they were doing it again, in the 1960s. And you've just got to get a lot into people before they really are ready to, be full people. And I don't know how that's done now. It's done in different ways, because people do grow up. But it's really useful when you get the kind of, a liberal education, a genuinely liberal education that includes, if you can't get Kafka, at least you can get Cervantes,
So,
Sophocles.
although younger in age, you are clearly an older soul than I. And so, what advice would you give our listeners? As if you wanted to bootstrap yourself into consciousness, political sensitivity, and maybe a compassionate orientation toward ourselves and our society, what would you recommend?
Well, for sure, the book of Genesis.
Okay.
For sure, the book of Genesis, and probably Exodus up until the giving of the Torah. There's a lot there, everybody should have that kind of foundational knowledge. We should all be able to keep those stories in mind. Um, we should all come away with an understanding of the evil of Egyptian slavery and oppression, um,
Well,
and
all of the, if you
freedom.
look at the Old Testament, it's in part prophetic, but it also represents a metaphor to guide us in current times.
I remember T.H. Huxley, Aldous' father, was going on about uh, the irreplaceable value. He invented the term agnostic to describe himself. Nonetheless, he felt that this book uh, was just essential for teaching young human beings um, what it meant to live through history and uh, and your role in history, um, and to make and to flesh history out, to let you're not just existing in space, but you exist as part of a tradition. So I would start with that, and I don't know, 1984. Would that be a good?
That is a start. Well, we're going to bring this to close. And Michael, once again, I absolutely love and honor your perspective on the world. We may not always agree, but you are certainly a very wise and thoughtful person from whom we can learn a lot. Uh, I look forward to further dialogues with you, and to our audience out there, I wish you well, wish you good health.
Amen. Amen.
And those of you who are experiencing heat like we're experiencing in both Detroit and in Reno, Nevada, hydrate well. Okay.
Use moisturizer.
Okay. Until next time, Michael, be well.
Shalom.